Like two of the neurotoxin, one classical example is the Clostridium botulinum toxin, which is 5 encoded. The second one is the tetanus toxin, and that is basically secreted by the Clostridium tetanus. What I'm going to do today is we are going to talk about the tetanus, what is the mode of action of the tetanus toxin. The tetanus toxin is also called as tetanospasmin. Tetanospasmin. Tetanospasmin is the same as the tetanus toxin. And we also talk about the tetanus toxoid vaccine. So once if you have suspected to have the tetanus, or if something rusty nail has poked you, you go to the hospital, the nurse is going to ask you and they will give you the tetanus vaccine. And that tetanus vaccine is nothing but it is inactivated, it contains the inactivated tetanus toxin. That inactivated tetanus toxin which is given to you will still be able to stimulate and to kick in your immune system, so as to create the memory cells, and those memory cells will remember next time when you get the tetanus, the memory cell will immediately recognize those tetanus toxins in the system. And it goes and binds to it and it neutralizes the action of the tetanus toxin. So, before we get on to the action of the tetanus toxin, just like the botulinum toxin, it inhibits the release of the excitatory neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Tetanus toxin, so the tetanus toxin inhibits release of the inhibitory neurotransmitter called as GABA, G-A-B-A. It inhibits the release of the inhibitory neurotransmitter called as GABA. What is GABA, anyone, folks? Good job. It is the gamma aminobutyric acid. Gamma aminobutyric acid. GABA, which is the gamma aminobutyric acid. Now with this background, like anytime you have a muscle, whenever, like I'm trying to pull it towards me, there are some muscle relaxing and at the same time, some of the muscles are contracting. That contraction and relaxation of the muscle is because of the antagonistic effect of some of those excitatory neurotransmitter and the inhibitory neurotransmitter. So anytime your muscle is contracting, there are some muscles which are relaxing at the same time. There's always a counter action of the contraction and relaxation of muscle. What in the case of the tetanus, what happens is the muscle, it remains in a state of constant contraction. There's no relaxation because those relaxation signals are given by the inhibitory neurotransmitters. So what happens if a person has a tetanus toxin, all the muscle will be in a constant state of contraction. There won't be any relaxation of the muscle. And that's one of the reasons why, I don't have the picture here, most tetanus, in extreme cases of tetanus, the body takes a arching, it gets arched. Because all the muscles are contracting, there's no relaxation of the muscle, so the body basically it arches arches. Not like a McDonald thing, but then still you can still feel, you can distinctly observe the arching of the body. But the problem is, oftentimes the death in tetanus or with tetany is not because of this thing, but because the diaphragm muscle gets locked in. So people die of tetanus because the diaphragm muscles get locked. They're in a constant state of contraction. They don't relax. And when the diaphragm muscles don't relax, you know what happens? You become hypoxic. And once you become hypoxic, it's a kind of a loop type thing gets into action. Once you become hypoxic, what happens? You know what? Your brain cells, because they require a continuous supply of oxygen, they are deprived of oxygen. Once the brain cells are deprived of oxygen, some of the nerve ending which supplies to some of the vital organs, they don't get the message from the brain. So eventually, all the system of the body it gets slowly fails. Because the diaphragm muscles are not working, so you cannot breathe in. No oxygen supply, so no oxygen breathing in means your brain cells do not get the proper oxygen. The brain cells need a continuous supply of oxygen because they are very metabolically active. When the brain cells don't get the oxygen, they tend to die off, and when they tend to die off, because the brain controls several vital organs of the body, and those vital organs, then they start to fall apart. The functioning of those vital organs are severely compromised. And that's why tetanus patients often die. The first thing what initiates the death process or spiraling of the death process is because the diaphragm muscles, they are not able to breathe. They feel hypoxic. Does that make sense to everyone? Everyone is clear for? So this is about the tetanus. And the next one we move on to some of those others, which is this one, the enterotoxin. The enterotoxin which is another class of toxin besides the other two, the cytotoxin, neurotoxin, that is, what is their final target of the toxin. Then you have some of the toxin that targets cells of the intestinal or the gastrointestinal system. And once it targets some cells of the gastrointestinal system, it basically disrupts the action, and eventually it leads to diarrhea. In certain instances, it may lead to bloody diarrhea or dysentery, but oftentimes it leads to diarrhea. A classical example of the enterotoxin is the Vibrio cholera toxin, the Salmonella toxin, Shigella toxin. Those are the classical example of the enterotoxin. Now let me start with the cholera toxin, but before I get on to the cholera toxin, a brief background. Cholera toxin is encoded by two of the cholera species. So cholera species, or the Vibrio cholerae species, or strains. Strains. STRE. The Vibrio cholera strain, there are two major ones. One was a very old one which is called as the Vibrio cholerae L. Tor strain. A new species of the Vibrio cholerae has started to circulate, which is mainly in some of the South Asian area, and that's called as Vibrio cholerae 0139 Bengal strain. This is one of the emerging this 0139 Bengal strain of the Vibrio cholerae is one of those emerging strain of the Vibrio cholerae. I call it an emerging strain because this bacteria is much more potent. It is resistant to many of the antibiotics and it is very potent. It is much more aggressive in its spread. It's called as a Bengal strain because it was first detected in some of the Vibrio cholerae species in the Bay of Bengal. From there, it has started to spread, and the spread is also very important. Thank you. I'll give you a second, and I'll do that. Oh, sure. Thank you. What I was talking about?
Very potent, antibiotic resistant.
Yeah, the Vibrio cholerae Bengal strain is also the one which is as an emerging strain. It is antibiotic resistance. It is spreading at a very fast pace, and at the same time, it is much more virulent strain. You see? So it's a nasty strain of the bacteria that is evolving, and that's why it is one of those emerging pathogens. In my infectious diseases, we talk about the Vibrio cholerae 0139 Bengal or 0139 Bengal strain. Besides that, it secretes an exotoxin, and this exotoxin is also AB type. It secretes the toxin which is the AB toxin. It has the AB toxin, and the toxin is carried on the phage genome. So it is a phage encoded toxin. The A unit or the A part, the B part is AB, so A part and the B part. The B part, as I mentioned earlier, this is involved in the binding. So here this is no exception, but the A part is made up of two subunits. There are two subunits of the A part. This is called as A1 and A2. So this A part, when this goes, it enters the cytoplasm. This is the part which enters the cytoplasm, and then it dissociates into A1 and the A2, and the A2 is the one which disintegrates. So once it enters the cytoplasm, the eighth unit or A part of the toxin would just dissociate into the A1 and the A2 subunits. The A2 subunit is the one that eventually would disintegrate within the cytoplasm. This A1, what it does, it activates an enzyme called as adenylate cyclase by an indirect mechanism. It activates, this one activates adenylate cyclase. It activates adenylate cyclase via an indirect mechanism. What is this indirect mechanism is? Adenylate cyclase per se is an enzyme. So adenylate cyclase. Can you tell me what is the substrate? What does it act upon? What is the thing adenylate cyclase acts upon? Pardon me? What is adenine? It acts upon the ATP to form the cyclic AMP. This is called as cyclic AMP. This cyclic AMP, which is generated inside the cell, it causes the export of some of the ions like potassium, chloride, sodium. So this induces export of chloride, sodium, potassium ions across the membrane. How about this? Is everybody on the same page?
Is this AD toxin secreted by both strains, or is it just the
Both the strains. Both the strains secretes the Vibrio cholerae toxin, which is the AB type toxin. And just like we talked about earlier also, all the AB toxin, the B part is the one which binds to the specific cell, and the A part enters inside. In the case of the Vibrio cholerae toxin, the A part is made up of two of the subunits, and once it goes inside the cell, it dissociates into the A1 and the A2. The A2 is the one that disintegrates, and the A1 is the active form. It activates the adenylate cyclase, but that activation is done in an indirect way. This adenylate cyclase is regulated by the G protein. The G protein, what it does, it regulates the adenylate cyclase. What the cholera toxin does, it gets the G protein in a locked state, like ADP ribosylating it, just like the diphtheria toxin. So this G protein, which regulates the adenylate cyclase, this is the target. This is the target of the cholera toxin. And what it does in reality is it locks in this G protein. What do you mean by it locks in the G protein? It means, just like if you keep a tap or water tap open, what happens? The water keeps flowing. or you turn on the valve, what happens? The valve is turned on, then the water keeps flowing. Yeah. The same way, toxin, the cholera toxin goes and it keeps the G protein in a locked state, and it continuously activates the adenylate cycles. How it keeps it in the locked state is it enhances, or the toxin catalyzes ADP ribosylation of G protein. So basically it is chemically modified. So the G protein is modified, and once the G protein is modified, it's like keeping the valve open. Once the G protein is always active, it will continuously activate the adenylate cyclase. And once the adenylate cyclase is activated, it will keep on shuttling out the sodium, potassium, chloride ions into the intestinal lumen. And because of osmosis, water will be drawn out of the cell. Is it too much? You must be tired. Oh, this is so easy. But this is so easy.
When you said indirect, you really.
I will tell you, it's over here, But I want you to get this part first. Once you get this part, the rest is a downhill. The rest is a downhill. So here, you see, so here, this picture and the following picture gives you a little bit better idea, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more. Yeah. No. It looks very scary, folks, but don't worry, I'm here. It looks very scary, but don't worry, I'll tell you. So this is a cholera toxin. If you look at the cholera toxin, it is made up of several subunits of the B unit, but don't worry about that one. The B unit, so there's the A and the B, and then the B unit helps it to bind to some of the receptor on the epithelial cell surface, which lines the intestinal tract. Now, once it binds, both the A part enters inside the cell. Part of the A1 that is activated, the part A2 part gets disintegrated inside the cell. But this A1, it shows here, it goes and activates the adenylate cyclase. But this activation of the adenylate cyclase is not direct one. It acts in an indirect way via the G protein. It doesn't do any alteration on the adenylate cycle. It doesn't modify the adenylate cycle. But it does it in an indirect way via the G protein. And once the adenylate cycle has been activated, it acts on the ATP, it generates cyclic AMP, and those cyclic AMP is the one, it stimulates the cell to secrete out the sodium, potassium, and many of the electrolytes into the lumen of the intestine. Once these ions are released in the intestine, then what happens is water tends to follow. It's a hyperosmotic environment has been created. And because of that hyperosmotic environment over here, there's a tendency, because this becomes the drier side of the membrane, because the plasma membrane is acting as a semi-permeable layer, a barrier. So water now goes from inside the cell to outside. That's what induces diarrhea. A couple of things to note. Before I go on, what are the clinical fallout from this water and the electrolyte loss, there's something you need to know that this is the G protein, what I was talking. This picture also, this is from a different textbook, folks. And look at this. This is the G protein. The G protein acts like a wheel, you know. It continuously, it basically gets locked in. And once it is locked in, this adenylate cyclase is continuously activated. It's in a state of constant activation. And how it is in a state of constant activation, what the toxin does, it ADP ribosylates the G protein. And once the G proteins are ribosylated or chemically modified, it keeps the adenylate cyclase always in the activated state. And that's when the cyclic AMP is generated, and over the course of time, a constant elevated level of cyclic AMP will cause the sodium, potassium, bicarbonate ions to get out, and then water would follow because of the osmotic effect. Some of the clinical condition that occurs following the loss of the water as well as the electrolyte is, first of all, it causes dehydration with metabolic acidosis. It causes dehydration with the metabolic acidosis. First of all, it causes dehydration and metabolic acidosis. That metabolic acidosis is mainly due to the loss of the bicarbonate ion. So there is dysregulation of the adenylate cyclase activity, water molecule gets out, some of the bicarbonate and those elements they get out. It causes dehydration and metabolic acidosis. That's the first one. Because of the constant loss of the potassium ions, it also causes or induces hypokalemia. Along with the hypokalemia, there is also what is called as hypovolumic shock. Hypovolumic shock is another thing that gets kicked in. And hypovolumic shock is mainly because there is the reduced blood volume. Due to the water loss, there is reduced blood volume. So this is because of the reduced blood volume. Now, this has a consequence. The consequence of the reduced blood volume is low pressure, and some of the vital organ functioning gets severely compromised. So then consequence is the vital organs functioning is compromised. Does it make sense? Everybody's on the same page? One of the first thing what needs to be done in a person who has the cholera or whenever there's cholera outbreak, you need to replenish the electrolytes. You need to replenish the electrolyte, and once the electrolytes are replenished, you might reverse some of the effects of the cholera toxin. At the same time, the individual will have the muscle cramps. There will be muscle cramps. And this is due to loss of the electrolytes. Due to loss of many of the electrolytes, the person or the individual will also experience cramps and muscle pain. So, if it is not, the person needs to be replenished with the electrolytes, and at the same time, they need to be replenished with the electrolytes, water, so that the blood volume is again restored. Otherwise, it leads to death due to the vital organ pain. This is one aspect. That's why sometimes when there's an outbreak of cholera, and that outbreak of cholera is mainly because of the substandard sewage treatment, or because of poor sanitation is one, poor sanitation, or sewage contamination. These are the primary reason when you get a cholera outbreak. These are some of the predisposing factors for cholera outbreak. So that's the reason why anytime there's a cholera outbreak, the public health department gets really concerned, and they get up in arms because it leads to two things. First of all, you need to control, you need to replenish the electrolytes, and secondly, you have to find out quickly what is the source of this cholera outbreak. Make sense? There's either substandard sanitation or a suboptimal sewage treatment, and that causes the cholera outbreak, because oftentimes cholera is transmitted by the oral fecal route. It's also transmitted by the oral fecal route. Clean drinking water is they also try to restore the clean drinking water. Remember, like when we had the Katrina problem, there was sudden outbreak of cholera. Am I correct, folks? There was a sudden outbreak of cholera. It's very rampant. It's very rampant in many parts of the world. Specifically, in some of the third world countries, children die. An alarming number of children that die because of cholera every year. We talked about the L-Tor. I did not talk about the L-Tor. The name L-Tor, you know how the name L-Tor came into being? L-Tor is a holy place in Egypt, if I'm not mistaken. It's somewhere in Egypt, if I'm not mistaken. Anybody from Egypt here? Okay. It's one of those holy places in Egypt, and it happened a long time back. People had gathered there from all over the world. They had come, and suddenly the local government was not able to handle that, and that was the first time there was an outbreak of cholera.
Yeah, Egypt.
It's in Egypt. Okay. So trust me. So it all happened because of some, gathering, religious gathering. People from all over the world, they gathered at that place because it's a holy place. And that was the first time the municipality system, it failed, it collapsed. And then there was an outbreak of cholera. Lots of people they died. That time we did not knew about cholera. Now we are very familiar what is cholera. Is that a happy ending?
Yes.
I hope you learned today something about cholera. So this is all in all about cholera. So we are done. Now to talk a little bit about the super antigens. But no, hold on. Super antigens. I'm not going to catch up on the whole thing, don't worry. Super antigens. No, you don't even have to take out your things. Don't worry. Super antigens. This is something new, this is very new. It all happened sometimes back when people did not knew about super antigen, and there were some of those female, the feminine hygienic thing, like the tampons they were introduced. Some young woman, when they were using some of the tampons, that was the time we found that some of the young menstruating women, suddenly they were being brought to the emergency because of a sudden drop in the blood pressure. And later we realized it's because of the super antigen. And some of the things we'll talk more about the super antigen, what does it do, and why bacteria secrete super antigen, how does it help the pathogen, we'll talk about it later. Okay? So I'm going to stop it here. Make sure, not for this exam, but try to catch up on this Vibrio cholerae and all. Oh, more. There will be more. When we talk about the respiration and